Welcome to a new episode of Conversations and Connections. I would like to acknowledge that I'm conducting this meeting from Melbourne, the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people. I pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. Professor Brett Neilson teaches at the Institute of Culture and Society, Western Sydney University. Thank you for joining us, Brett. It's been a while since we last met, and I hope that you've been in good health.
I have been, yes. I can happily report.
It's been really a long time, more than 2 years, obviously, because of the pandemic. And even before that, your visits to India have been fewer in the last few years.
The last time I was in India was in 2018.
Okay. Not so long ago then. So Brett, can we start by talking a little bit about your new book? Since then, you've had this amazing new book with Sandra Mezzadra, The Politics of Operations, right? And can you tell us a little bit about the book and how you looked at extraction, logistics, and finance across various parts of the world?
Well, the book, as you say, takes extraction, logistics, and finance as points of departure for looking at changing configurations of economics and politics in different parts of the world. So we use extraction, logistics, and finance very much as points of entry into debates and empirical investigations, rather than trying to pick them out as dominant tendencies that explain everything. We're interested in the way they interact and intertwine with each other, and we're interested in the way in which they organize particular kinds of operations, what we call operations of capital, which both articulate with each other to form a wider capitalist system, but also take particular shapes and forms in different places around the world. So this has very much been our interest in the book.
When you say operations of capital, and your book is exhaustive, it looks at different cities and different countries. Can you describe a little bit more about the kind of work you were doing?
Well, part of the book is based on fieldwork in places around the world where we had opportunity to work. And some of the other case studies we pursue in the book are based on engagement with the published work of other researchers, particularly those working in the fields of anthropology and geography. So the field-based disciplines. And I guess the best way is to give an example. For instance, one place where research was conducted by one of our teams was the Port of Piraeus in Greece, which is a port where there are now significant Chinese interests. In fact, the port since 2016 has been run by the Chinese state-owned enterprise, COSCO. So we were very much interested in what are the differences to the actual kinds of physical operations on the ground. How are they articulated through these kind of geopolitical arrangements, whereby China has an economic interest in a kind of small economic zone in Europe. And we're very much interested in the kind of technical and software operations of how logistics runs in the port and the implications of those routines for workers on the ground in that particular workplace.
Can I just stay with this, with the Piraeus port? Because, culturally, Piraeus would be like, for a lot of historians and Europeans mainly, would be like the gateway to Europe from the east. I didn't know that it was now part of a Chinese company. I really didn't know that. Has it really changed things materially on the ground? I mean, does it mean that there are new workers or new contracts? Has it really changed stuff on the ground in the port?
It has. I mean, when we conducted our research there, it was 2014. So the port was divided into halves. In one side, you still had the Piraeus Port Authority operating, and the other side was leased to the Chinese state enterprise COSCO. I hesitate calling this the Greek and the Chinese sides of the port. However, in that side of the port, which was still under the Port Authority, unions were very active. On the other side of the port, there was less union activity. On the Greek side of the port, the workers tended to be 50, 60 years old men. On the other side of the port, men 30 to 40 years of age. The workers on the Chinese side of the port tended to have a higher educational level, but more precarious employment conditions. And there were different port terminal operating software packages in operation on either side of the port. So indeed, there were consequences for the way in which the port was running. But I think the first point you make about Piraeus being a kind of gateway between the East and West is quite important as well, because apart from the actual empirical arrangements which one can discover on the ground, there's a lot of kind of rhetorical fire that goes on about this particular situation. I mean, one only has to read the first sentence of that famous book, which is Plato's Republic, which says, "I went down to the Piraeus yesterday." There is kind of a claim for this site to be a birthplace of Western politics and metaphysics. So when you have a Chinese state enterprise with interests in this site, the rhetorical and civilizational flames tend to fly. So our work was very much involved in looking at the situation on the ground in order to sort of calm these rhetorical sparks.
Well, amazing. But did the pandemic change the landscape that you were looking at earlier in terms of extraction, logistics, and finance?
Well, yes, I would say definitely. I mean, one only has to look at the effects of supply chain blockage during the pandemic to see how this spread of infection had an effect upon working lives, trade, and global mobilities. So it's interesting. I think it's an interesting question of whether this pandemic that we're facing whether we can conceive of it as a crisis, or whether we need other kinds of concepts to describe what might be a condition which is more permanently changed, as opposed to following the kind of boom-bust curve that we're familiar with in the model of a crisis. It's significant that the economic effects of the pandemic have derived primarily from the removal of bodies from workplaces due to lockdowns and other public health measures. And to this extent, it's very different from the 2008 crisis, which is generated from within the financial system. So this is immediately a kind of point of difference and a point of analysis that relates very strongly to the work that Sandra and I did in the politics of operations. I've spent a lot of the last couple of years in lockdown myself trying to understand the dynamics of supply chain blockages, both in an economic and a geopolitical sense. It's, you can see, for instance, in the patterns of global shipping, the double dip in 2020, which was linked to the lockdowns in China first and then the lockdowns in the rest of the world. And you can see in the discussions of supply chain dynamics how the pandemic has been shifting them away from models of efficiency and lean production and beyond discourses of resiliency to ideas like viability, which, these are, I'm just throwing off the concepts, but in terms of the sort of modeling, mathematical modeling that underlies supply chain management, they're quite different propositions. So one is able to navigate tangible shifts in these arrangements. It's important to also recognize those sectors that have been the winners of the pandemic, particularly in e-commerce and in many forms of platform economy. So the questions of data extraction that have been central to our investigation of politics of operations become prominent in that context. And of course, the question of the essential worker is one that needs to be grappled with. I don't think there is a valid political analysis of the pandemic which does not grapple with that question.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt your flow, but because you touched on this question of data, and you and Sandra have been working a lot on this, what kind of role has big data, whether it's collection and storage, what kind of role has it played in the last few years leading up to the pandemic? And do you see it changing from here on, the role of data gathering and collection?
Well, there certainly has been a lot of hype surrounding big data, as we know, and a lot of business activity and public debate around issues like privacy and extraction. My own approach to this has been through a study of data centers. So I've been very interested in the physical infrastructures of data collection and storage. And I've conducted a large research project between Hong Kong, Singapore, and Sydney on this topic. So I've been interested in the whole question of where data centers are, I think is really crucial. In Southeast Asia, for instance, over 50% of the servers in the region are located in the small island of Singapore, which has presented itself as a data center hub. So you have new relations articulated through these kinds of technologies that are shifting the kinds of networks and mesh patterns through which we think about issues of global production and distribution in ways that massively increase the kind of turnover time of the economy. And so, this is a scenario we had as we moved into the pandemic. I think with the pandemic, the role of these routines and technologies has become much more prominent because it's present in public health measures and everyday lives to a greater extent. So I think that the pandemic is kind of a threshold point with respect to these debates, particularly around privacy and extraction and so forth. So you could take the line that says, I'm not going to use QR codes. I'm not going to download COVID apps and so forth, because this is a kind of surveillance from the state or from private entities in which I don't want to partake. I think the pandemic has brought a kind of threshold where these kinds of stances have become more problematic. And the debate now has to be, what is an appropriate form of data governance? How do governments and other private entities involved in the data economy arrange the governance of these data that are being collected and vacuumed up on a scale like never before? The questions of how that might be done and the politics of how that might be done, I think, are questions that have come more to the fore rather than a kind of black and white, I'm either in or I'm out kind of debate, which, of course, still goes on with many forms of refusal that are prominent in pandemic politics. But I think that was those kinds of conditions and stances, ones that have been modulated and changed by the spread of COVID around the world.
I think that's a great point. I mean, it allows me to also think about how people receive technology differently. I think here it's a very personal question as well, because I see someone like myself, my father. We don't adapt to technology very, very well, and even getting an OTP freaks me out sometimes. So how does let's say, as we move forward from here, how do people like us, or those who are hesitant to use technology, how are they drawn into, let's say, a world of public health, or even getting your pension or your bank account fixed as we move forward? Because the fact is, I think, as we see more and more people getting drawn into the world of data and having to give their personal data onto the government or to companies, a significant number of people are also hesitant to join that. I'll give you an example. People who are much smarter than me in using online stuff like PayPal and all of that, when the COVID apps were rolled out in India, very few of them actually used them. They didn't. They just said, no, we're not going to use them. These were the local grocery guys and the guys, young guys in the shops and everything. They just didn't use them. Whereas my retired neighbors and we were downloading every app there is. So how do you draw everyone along in this new kind of world?
Yeah, I guess it's an interesting question. I mean, I think the pandemic again represents a threshold where more people are drawn in to these routines and the technologies associated with them. And, frankly, I think some people will be left behind. Say the older person who does not possess a smartphone, if there's going to be a vaccine certificate which allows certain forms of mobility, the easiest way to present that will be on a portable device, and carrying around a printed record will pose problems of verifiability, which also exist with the smartphone technology. So some people will just struggle because they're not kind of in the loop of these technologies. But there are other kinds of subjects as well. I mean, the people you mentioned, the grocery boys you mentioned, who see opportunities to, conduct their economic lives in ways that don't pass through these channels, but may be acting in ways that are socially responsible with respect to infection and with respect to their health, their own health and their own families. And there are also people who are very highly embedded in digital culture and understand it deeply, who have forms of refusal as well, who don't want their privacy tracked, who are able to use all sorts of different kinds of apps and avenues and, blockers and regulating the scripts that come to browsers and so forth, who are very active on this front as well. So there's also a very highly technological literate part of the population that is having to adjust the way in which it engages with these kinds of technologies. And I think it's worth mentioning that there will always be, it's coming back to the discourse on finance, but there will also always be so-called unbanked populations. I mean, the question of how you can draw populations that are not involved in banking and credit systems into credit systems, as you will know, is one of the frontiers of economic activity in the world today. So I think that these routines that will identify people that are, could be drawn into the financial economy, whether through forms of microcredit or other, kinds of financial technologies, will always have those that are excluded from them, always those who are seen as, beyond the pale, truly unbankable. So there are, I would say, multiple outsides to these technologies and the politics and economics that they carry, and that these multiple outsides are quite unlike each other and have to be thought through one by one, sometimes using different analytical and conceptual schema.
So, the obvious question then for someone like you who follows working class politics and workers, mobilization, how has this whole online world and the whole world of gig economy and everything, how has this affected workers' agencies on the ground?
Well, again, in different ways, in different settings. If I can give you two examples, rather than trying to paint out a whole kind of range of examples. At the moment, I'm in a research project which is looking at automation in warehouse environments. And the warehouse has been, I'd say, one of the theatres of this transformation, where artificial intelligence technologies and other forms of automation are prominent, but unable to do everything. Human labor is still required. And warehouses, is particularly e-commerce warehouses, associated with companies like Amazon, Alibaba, and so forth, are very busy during conditions of lockdown. So I think what one can say about the effect on workers in these scenarios is that the online technologies are very much involved in a close control of the labor process. So you have a kind of real-time monitoring of labor performance and incentives and rewards for workers articulated around those forms of real-time monitoring. You have interesting cases in warehouses where workers can decide, to go off the script of what the technologies are telling them to do in their kind of picking and packing processes, just because they spend their time in that space and they end up knowing better than the artificial intelligence the ways to move efficiently through the space and accomplish their task. However, the main purpose of the technology here is the monitoring of the worker and the control of the labor process. Now let's flip back to Piraeus on the Chinese side of the port, where you have advanced forms of technology and automation, which are operating in quite a different way. So in this context, you have something known as process mining happening. Process mining is a form of data mining where what's being tracked is not worker moves, but the moves of the most expensive pieces of equipment. So in a port which is accepting large post-Panamax ships coming from China, I mean, these are really the vessels of global commerce in physical logistics these days. You need large, expensive pieces of equipment like certain kinds of cranes and so forth, pieces of fixed capital, which are very expensive. And the aim of the technology in this situation is to minimize the idleness of these people, of these pieces of hardware. So the automation routines are looking to make efficient the use of the most expensive pieces of fixed capital. Now, for workers, that has an implication because they are called in on and off in a very precarious manner in order to smooth out the logistical flows. So, when there's a big ship in port, the workers are called in, and when the ship is not there, there are less workers. So it has an implication for the workers, but it's not their every move and their labor performance that is being monitored in this situation. It's the moves of the equipment that are being monitored. And I think these kinds of differences are ones we really need to take into account because, I don't know, if we can think in analogy in the way in which Michel Foucault said the panopticon is becoming the model of society, I think often we're now at a point in history where we think that the Amazon warehouse is becoming the model of society as a whole. But there are other kinds of arrangements in other sites and other sectors, which I think are equally important and which we need to track, and we need to think through the differences to understand the arrangements of power in the contemporary world situation.
I mean, thanks a lot. I mean, Brett, this is such an amazing way for me to kind of segue into the last question. So can you tell us a little bit about your engagement with colleagues in India and in South Asia? And in more general terms, where do you see new exciting collaboration in social sciences research between Australia and India?
Well, I've been quite involved with friends and colleagues in different research projects across the years, both working closely with colleagues conducting research on the subcontinent, but also having friends and colleagues from the subcontinent come to some of these other sites in which we've worked, such as in Greece or Latin America or Singapore, some of the places I've mentioned, to offer their insights. So I think this form of collaboration is very fertile, and that when Australian researchers collaborate with researchers from India or other parts of the subcontinent, doesn't necessarily have to be about India or Australia. And I think that this is really crucial because both of these countries live in a region which is becoming more congested and more central in the contemporary world picture. So just the very fact that, for decades in Australia, we discussed the position of the country in the Asia Pacific, and that this discourse has shifted decisively in the last few years to a discourse around the Indo-Pacific. Now, this is significant for both countries, but it's also very much a reaction to the changing position of China. And there are certainly geopolitical developments in which both countries are involved, which are moving closely, not in lockstep, but reacting to the changed politics, geographies, and cultural formations of this, let's use the term, Indo-Pacific region. So I think there are important intellectual projects to be done in these circumstances around the forms of contestation and competition that are emerging, but also around the very possibilities for international research collaboration. So I think it's very important in these circumstances that Indian and Australian intellectuals in their collaborations think about also the possibility of involving Chinese intellectuals and the perspective they can give us on these changes. And I really see a need, certainly in the public sphere in Australia, to pursue a kind of anti-Chinese discourse, which would not be a kind of pro-China discourse. I'm not advocating a kind of Chinese cultural nationalism. And cultural nationalism is on the rise everywhere, and there's always the danger if someone says, make certain stances around China in Australia, that there will be attack from Chinese cultural nationalists. I think we need to find intellectual positions and research positions that work around this reality, but can also speak back to it. And that means keeping lines of collaboration strong and open, not only between Australia and India, but also between Australia, India, and China.
On that wise note, Brett, thank you so much for sparing time for us. And I hope we'll see you soon again once this lockdown is over.
I hope so, yes. Sydney and Melbourne are not far apart.
They're not far apart at all. Yeah. All right. Thank you so much.
Long overdue for a celebratory meeting.